Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Jintalks. As always, this is a video adaptation of an INN article I've written, a link to which will be in the description below if you'd rather read than listen to this. Now, if you've ever taken the briefest interest in FCing, or really any EVE PvP at all, you'll know how crucial positioning is to winning a fight. Putting your fleet in a spot where they can kill the enemy whilst the enemy can't kill them is one of the most effective ways to establish control over a fight and leverage any other advantages that you might have against the opposing fleet. Finding that sweet spot of range and safety, however, is the crux of the issue when it comes to determining where you should be positioning yourself on grid, and it's not something that I can easily answer, as going through every single doctrine and how it matches up against every other doctrine would be a video that would take just so much time to produce that by the time it came out, all the information of it would probably have been made useless, even with CCP's balancing schedule. As such, rather than focusing in on one specific weapon system or doctrine, we're instead going to look at a general module, which will be a threat over multiple different fleet types, in order to allow you to more effectively evaluate the range at which it can impact you in a variety of fleet combat situations. We're going to start right at the very top, however, and go for what I think is probably the single most impactful force multiplier that any fleet can bring to the field, and that's long-range webs. Now, the reason that webs are this crucial part of fleet PvP is, in my opinion, because it's one of the few modules in the game which allows for offensive range control, by being able to reach out and slow down any target. And this has a number of effects that you should be familiar with, such as allowing guns with poor tracking to apply to smaller targets such as cruisers or destroyers, or to hold a ship that's out of logistics range in place so that it can be destroyed without being repaired by the enemy fleet. On top of this, however, they also come with a lot more sneaky fleet applications which might not immediately spring to mind. For example, webbing down a fleet's FC or anchor will either force the fleet to be following a ship which is moving at a webbed velocity, effectively allowing you to mirror that web across a large amount of ships, or force them to change anchor. Changing anchors is also no easy task, however, and it's often something that can come with a level of disruption in the command chain, as people don't realise that they need to be anchored up on a new person until multiple seconds later, which can lead to the fleet becoming spread out and having a diffusivity of threat on the battlefield. In addition to this, it's normally the case that the backup anchor is worse than the primary anchor, which means that you, as an FC, are now fighting against worse positional opponents than you would have previously, which is obviously something to your advantage. Now, given all that, hopefully you understand why you should be wary of where your opponent's webbing ships are on the field, and in order to understand where you should be in relation to those, you should always know what ranges they actually web at. And in order to do that, I've presented a little infographic here. One ship that's not represented on here that possibly should be, however, is the Hyena, and the Hyena can web at 50 kilometers using a T2 web, and further than that if it uses a faction web, although it's very unlikely that you'll run into a Fed Navy web Hyena anytime soon. I should note that I include skirmish links in these figures, as obviously skirmish links increase the range of your webs, and are pretty much a mandatory part of any large fleet, especially if you're going to rely on webs to actually allow your weapon systems to apply, such as with Macarials. Anyway, to follow on from all of this, it's time to take this out of simply looking at the raw numbers and look at the more slightly complicated and fuzzy numbers of a matchup that you might see on Tranquility today. And in this case, I think the Ferox and Muninn matchup represents an interesting example of how webs can change the layout of a matchup. So let's lay out the basic facts and put the fits up on the screen. As you can see, the Muninn has complete range control over the matchup, being able to move at 2,760 meters a second versus the Ferox's 1,073 meters a second. Also, by virtue of its lower cap usage, it's able to run its MWD for much longer, which will enable it to keep up its positional advantage for longer in the fight, and reposition easier. The Ferox, however, has better range and DPS projection, dealing 277 DPS at 122 km with Spike, versus 252 DPS at 96.8 km for the Muninn. The Ferox has a slight EHP advantage over the Muninn if its ADCU is inactive, with 73.2k EHP versus 55.1k EHP. However, the Muninn obviously gains a significant advantage in EHP if it's able to activate its EDCU before any significant damage is received. And finally, both ships can actually track each other relatively well as they're using medium guns. However, the Munins have a small enough signature radius to be able to rely somewhat on mitigation, whilst the Feroxes are not going to be able to do so given the fact that they are both a battlecruiser and shield fit, and have an MWD that they're probably going to be running for a significant period of time. Now, given these factors, in theory it might make sense to try and get close in order to use the Munin's speed advantage and low signature to try and get under the Ferox's guns. And if we look at the DPS graph, it would theoretically allow us to take advantage of the highest on-paper DPS differential between the doctrines, which is at the 10 to 30 kilometers range. And for future reference, all of these graphs are produced using the opposing ship as a target, moving at full speed at 60 degrees to the firing ship, as that's generally what I've found to be a good combat analogue. However, as we know from earlier, entering anywhere close to this range in order to try and utilise this mismatch puts you firmly under the threat of webs, and as such, the graph presented above doesn't represent the reality of the situation, leaving you with an applied damage graph that looks more like this once you actually take webs into the equation and apply them to both ships. This means that the Feroxes are going to be able to achieve an applied DPS that's on par with the Munins with only a single web, and the Munins would then have to get even closer in order to start taking advantage of their mitigation once more, and doing so would open them up to further threats such as energy neutralizers or warp scramblers. These threats then threaten to take away one of the key advantages which we highlighted at the start of this breakdown for the Munins, which is their ability to dictate the range of the fight using their speed, and their speed is almost entirely reliant on their MWD, which can be shut down with only a couple of neutralizers or a single scram. It also takes away one of the main uses of being able to dictate that range in the first place, which is giving yourself the option to easily disengage from a fight if you believe that the fight is not going in your way, or in order to react to the changing situation. For example, if one of the Feroxes that you're fighting lights a Cyno and brings in some capital support, it will allow you to easily disengage from the situation before being locked down and killed by any carriers or dreadnoughts that have landed. As a result of this, Munins will generally try and fight outside of web range when engaging Feroxes, in order to exploit a DPS mismatch which falls outside of this range, in order to allow them to retain their mobility when fighting within the matchup. In this particular case, the preferred range is actually the 90 to 110 kilometer bracket, where thorium doesn't reach far enough and spike lacks the distance to be able to properly track. Increasing the distance at which the fight takes place also has the effect of lowering the overall DPS experienced by both sides, which increases the time to kill of the DPS-based Ferox fleet, whilst not affecting the time to kill of the mostly alpha-based Munins. This allows the Munins more time to catch reps without offering the same to the Ferox fleet in return. The increased time to kill also allows the Muninn pilots more time to activate their ADCU, which helps tilt the EHP factor back in the Munin's favour, as long as they're able to activate it early enough on an individual basis. It's also worth noting that staying at this range for a short period of time during the opening of a fight doesn't preclude moving in closer range later, especially if all the webbing ships can be dealt with at this range using coordinated alpha strikes before turning in and going for the kill later on, when you need to utilise higher DPS ammo in order to kill the fleet more efficiently. This specific matchup and also point of DPS mismatch makes a compelling argument for Feroxes to be bringing tungsten, however, if they expect to be fighting Munins to any large degree in a theatre of war, as it almost makes them competitive at this kind of range in terms of damage applied to the Munins, although the Munins do retain a clear advantage. For most existing FCs, I'm sure that the ranges of webs, alongside logistics, boosts, and a myriad of other things, are already etched firmly into your brain. However, for aspiring FCs, starting to build up an awareness for what's going on the battlefield is crucial for your future success and your ability to understand the battlefield when you're in the driving role. Try and pay attention to where your DPS or logistics pilots are positioned with regards to your opponent's recons, and try and understand why this particular spot has been chosen, and whether or not you can be webbed is impacting the effective DPS both fleets are applying to one another. If you can figure that out on the fly, then you're most of the way to being a good large-scale block FC already. Looking at Pythor and understanding how well your fleets can apply to ships that you expect to fight with and without webs, and at various ranges and angles, is also something I highly recommend. Not only will it better highlight to you how crucial they are to a fleet composition, but it will also allow you to pinpoint DPS mismatches of your own, and decide where you should position yourself on grid in advance. And that's always crucial. Make sure that you go into any fight with a game plan. If you don't, you're going to be guessing on the fly, and that's never going to be as effective as knowing beforehand where you should be. Still, I hope this has helped at the very least, and keep your eyes peeled for one of these coming your way in the future. Until then, fly smart and take care.